Before dawn broke over Ouagadougou, silence was shattered by a decision that would ripple across a continent. 17 locations fell under the command of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, each revealing not the promise of aid, but the machinery of surveillance. Within hours, more than 2 million profiles of Burkinabe citizens were seized. Biometric scans, call records, government files, fragments of identity stored offshore, and copied without consent. For Africa, it was not simply another dawn raid. It was a line drawn in the sand. If the lifeblood of governance, information itself, is drained abroad, then sovereignty becomes a word without weight. Yet in that moment, a young officer stood as a symbol that silence was no longer an option. The question is not only what was discovered in those hidden rooms of servers and cables. The question is what it means for the continent's future. Will Africa continue to live under invisible chains? Or will this be the morning it begins to speak in its own voice? Stay with us, for this is more than a headline. It is a turning point in history. Subscribe and walk with us as we trace the story of how Africa is redefining its place in the digital age. It began in the dim light of a Thursday morning. At 5 o'clock, an order was signed, and by 7, the streets of Ouagadougou bore witness to something no West African capital had seen before. 17 facilities were struck in perfect synchrony. Black vehicles marked with military insignia lined the avenues. Helicopters hovered low above districts close to government buildings. By the time clock struck 8:45, the entire city knew that a veil had been torn away. What appeared from the outside as charity offices and agricultural development hubs revealed a different truth once doors were forced open. Inside, investigators found servers humming with stolen secrets, routers encrypted to reroute calls to foreign servers, and stacks of hard drives storing the fingerprints of a nation. 2 million profiles were recovered. Names, addresses, biometric scans, even the echoes of ministerial conversations, stretching back more than 8 years. This was not random intrusion. The pattern was systematic, the technology sophisticated. IP traces led back to Herzliya, Israel, a city long associated with intelligence industries. One office, painted with banners promising digital agriculture, concealed satellite transmission nodes capable of copying entire databases. Another, a warehouse only steps away from the Ministry of Education, held a vault of citizen records, silently transmitted across invisible networks. The revelations did more than expose espionage. They forced a reckoning with a simple but devastating question. If a nation's information is harvested abroad, can its sovereignty survive at home? Maps of mineral reserves, transcripts of cabinet meetings, and intercepted strategy papers told a story of a continent observed without consent. For Burkina Faso, landlocked yet proud, this was not merely about technology, it was about survival. Witnesses described troops carrying servers out under the rising sun, their metallic frames glinting like stolen treasure reclaimed. Videos spread within hours, shared across African networks, showing hard drives sealed in evidence bags, soldiers guarding doorways once adorned with aid slogans. The contrast was stark. Banners promising development now hanging above rooms wired for surveillance. Officials were careful with their words, describing the raids as surgical and precise. No civilian casualties were reported, no chaos allowed to spill into the streets. But the message was unambiguous. What had been tolerated in shadows for 15 years would no longer be hidden in plain sight. Colonel Isufu Zongo spoke at a press briefing, his voice resonant. This was not assistance. This was systematic surveillance. Burkina Faso cannot and will not allow the exploitation of its citizens' privacy, its natural resources, or its national security. His words captured a sentiment felt far beyond the borders of his homeland. For analysts, the scale was unprecedented. Never before had a West African nation dismantled such a network in one morning. Never before had digital espionage, long whispered about, been revealed so openly. And never before had a young officer like Ibrahim Traoré positioned himself as the figure to lead this exposure. As daylight settled on Ouagadougou, 17 compounds remained under armed guard. Forensic teams cataloged seized materials. Citizens gathered outside the sealed gates, murmuring in disbelief that data, invisible, intangible, had become the front line of their nation's independence. The soil of Africa has long been plundered for its gold, its manganese, its oil. But now another harvest was being taken, one of information. And just as land once stolen became the rallying cry for independence, so too would data become the new frontier of freedom. Yet if one nation could uncover such a hidden empire, what of its neighbors? Were Lagos, Nairobi, and Dakar already under the same silent occupation? And if so, how deep did these invisible roots run across the continent? This was the question that lingered like smoke over Ouagadougou. The dawn raids had pulled back the curtain. But what came next promised to shake more than a city. It would shake the conscience of an entire continent. The morning after the raids, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped before the cameras. His uniform was simple, his words uncompromising. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are not your test subjects. This continent will no longer be your blind spot. The statement traveled faster than the dust of the Ouagadougou streets, carried across radios, televisions, and mobile phones. It was more than a speech. It was a declaration that Africa's silence had ended. Crowds surged into markets and public squares. Young activists painted city walls with the phrase, "Our data, our choice." Mothers marched with placards reading, "Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty." Students unfurled banners that cried, "Africa is not for sale." In Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry, similar scenes unfolded. The slogans echoed like the chants of past liberation movements. Only this time, the battleground was not soil or stone, but the invisible wires of cyberspace. Regional governments moved swiftly. Mali confirmed the shutdown of 3 firms suspected of funneling citizen data abroad. Guinea announced the freezing of all military imports tied to Israeli contractors. Niger neutralized a surveillance compound linked to a foreign embassy. In Lomé, Togo suspended its telecom contracts pending urgent review. Within 48 hours, what began as a single operation in Burkina Faso had triggered a coordinated response across West Africa. For analysts, the speed of this chain reaction was unprecedented. For decades, regional meetings among presidents had revolved around aid packages or external loans. Now the topic was sovereignty, not begged from abroad but defended against it. Political scientist Dr. Amadou Sissoko remarked from Bamako, "For the first time in a generation, heads of state are uniting not to request assistance, but to safeguard themselves against it." This is a continental pivot. Social media amplified the momentum. Hashtags surged across West Africa. #Our data, our choice. #Africa not for sale. Digital sovereignty. Videos of soldiers removing servers went viral. Interviews with citizens, market vendors, and university lecturers revealed a common feeling: outrage that foreign powers could siphon identities and resources so quietly for so long. Yet alongside the anger, there was also pride. Pride that one of their own nations had dared to expose what others whispered about. Western media, however, painted a different picture. In Paris, newspapers described Traoré as authoritarian. In London, editorials framed him as destabilizing West Africa. In Washington, think tanks labeled him radical, a threat to stability. These portrayals contrasted sharply with the tone in African and Asian outlets. Al Jazeera described the raids as the unveiling of a hidden empire. China's Global Times hailed the events as a turning point in technological independence. Russian media framed them as proof of Western hypocrisy. The dissonance was clear. For some, Traoré was a pariah. For others, a pioneer. But within Africa, the verdict seemed settled. Demonstrations were not violent riots, but disciplined displays of resolve. Protesters carried symbols of keys and chains, declaring that data was the new lock to be broken. Civil society leaders compared the moment to earlier independence struggles, calling it a second liberation fought not with rifles but with firewalls. Diplomatic corridors grew tense. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu phoned Traoré directly, urging restraint and denying espionage. The call lasted 12 minutes. Sources later reported that Traoré's reply was sharp. "There is no misunderstanding when you spy on us. That is not development. That is occupation." The line was repeated across Africa's airwaves, crystallizing into a mantra of defiance. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou itself, soldiers stood guard over the sealed compounds. Evidence was being cataloged, contracts examined, servers disassembled. Each press release fed the sense that this was not theater, but substance. Analysts confirmed the authenticity of seized documents, showing satellite maps of mineral-rich regions, intercepted government communications, and duplicated voter databases. The atmosphere in the capital was electric. On the surface, life continued. Markets bustled, taxis honked, children played. But beneath, a new current flowed, the belief that history had shifted. People spoke of data in the same breath as land and water, recognizing that in the 21st century, sovereignty extended into code and cable. And yet the question loomed: this wave of unity, this spark of defiance, would it endure? Or would the continent's reaction fracture under external pressure, economic sanctions, or political fatigue? The raids had lit a fire. The reaction had fanned its flames. Now the continent stood at the edge of something larger, a transformation that would either wither or blaze into a doctrine. In the weeks that followed Operation Clear Sight, life in Burkina Faso began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The raid had not only uncovered hidden servers, it had revealed a hidden reality that touched every citizen. For years, people had spoken casually on phones, filled out voter registration forms, or logged into school systems, unaware that their personal details might be siphoned off into distant vaults. Now that awareness had sunk deep into the national consciousness. Government officials acted quickly. New regulations demanded that all citizen data be stored on servers physically located within Burkina Faso. Foreign companies were ordered to submit to independent audits, with any sign of non-compliance leading to immediate contract termination. A law requiring telecom operators to disclose every strand of their infrastructure was passed through the National Assembly in record time. For some, these moves seemed radical. For others, they were long overdue. The effects were felt almost immediately. Internet speeds doubled within 6 months as contracts were restructured with transparent regional providers. The cost of mobile data dropped by nearly half, creating access for students and traders who had long rationed their connectivity. At the same time, cybersecurity breaches fell by almost 50%, a dramatic improvement attributed to the removal of foreign control backdoors. Yet the changes were not only technical, they were cultural. In Ouagadougou's markets, vendors spoke of digital sovereignty in the same way their parents had once spoken of land reform. In classrooms, professors taught that independence had to be defended not only with borders, but with servers. On campuses, students coined new slogans: "No cloud unless it is ours." Murals appeared on walls showing chains of data broken by African hands. For ordinary citizens, the sense of violation turned into determination. Anger at the thought of their biometric scans and health records being stored abroad became pride that their country had taken a stand. Across villages and towns, radio programs explained how privacy was not a luxury, but a right. The language of technology entered the rhythms of daily conversation. The political consequences were just as dramatic. Opposition parties, initially skeptical of Traoré's bold moves, found little ground to criticize. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the new regulations, with approval ratings among young citizens soaring above 80%. Civil society groups that once debated aid dependency now spoke of code and cables, recognizing that sovereignty had migrated into the digital realm. But with every step forward came new risks. European contractors withdrew, citing unworkable conditions. Some warned of sanctions if Burkina Faso continued to isolate itself from global norms. Multinational corporations delayed projects, waiting to see whether the regulations would hold. Critics cautioned that without significant investment in training engineers and maintaining infrastructure, the dream of independence might falter into dependence on new partners. Still, the symbolic shift was undeniable. A Burkinabe startup launched a cloud storage platform certified under the new sovereignty standards. A Nigerian fintech company announced it would relocate services from Europe back to Africa to comply with local rules. These stories were not just about business, they were about dignity. They showed that the continent could generate its own solutions rather than waiting for others to provide them. Observers began to call it a second independence, one not fought with rifles in the bush, but with firewalls in the data center. This framing resonated deeply. Across Africa, intellectuals began to describe the Dawn raids as part of a broader anti-colonial Africa movement, not against the physical presence of foreign troops, but against the invisible domination of digital infrastructures. Independence, they argued, must now be defended on new frontiers. As the sense of pride grew, so too did the recognition of responsibility. Protecting data required more than rhetoric. It required engineers to code, regulators to enforce, and citizens to demand accountability. The government established scholarships for young students to study information security and network engineering, announcing that the defense of sovereignty needed hands as much as words. The debate spilled into living rooms, mosques, and cafes. Was this bold new doctrine sustainable? Could Burkina Faso maintain its rules under pressure from powerful economies? Would unity hold across Africa, or would rival interests divide the effort? For many, these questions did not weaken their resolve. They strengthened it, because the Dawn raids had shown one simple truth: sovereignty could no longer be confined to borders on a map. It lived in the cables beneath the streets, the servers in dimly lit rooms, and the codes written by unseen hands. The consequences were immediate, the challenges immense, but the spirit undeniable. The soil had been defended once in the past. Now the data would have to be defended too. And yet, a larger storm brewed beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The revelations had provoked not only neighbors but global powers. The next chapter would not be written in Ouagadougou alone. It would be written in the halls of the African Union, in the offices of Brussels, Washington, and Beijing. The shockwaves from Ouagadougou traveled far beyond West Africa. Within 24 hours of the raids, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu phoned Captain Ibrahim Traoré, insisting that Israel's activities were developmental, not espionage. His words, however, fell flat. "There is no misunderstanding when you spy on us," Traoré reportedly replied. "That is not development. That is occupation." The call ended after 12 minutes, unresolved but unforgettable. Western governments reacted with caution, yet their language was telling. In Paris, officials warned that the doctrine emerging from Burkina Faso could destabilize regional relations. London described the new policies as isolationist. In Washington, think tanks circulated reports labeling Traoré radical, a destabilizing force in an already fragile Sahel. Editorials in major newspapers framed the movement not as emancipation, but as a threat to global investment norms. Yet across Africa, the narrative diverged sharply. The African Union convened an emergency session in Addis Ababa, where delegates from 25 member states debated late into the night. Nigeria's representative declared, "If one nation's data is stolen, all nations are at risk." The chamber erupted in applause. A draft resolution was tabled to enshrine digital sovereignty as a collective principle, to defend data as fiercely as borders. Observers likened the moment to the 19th century Monroe Doctrine in the United States, but rewritten for the digital age. Meanwhile, other global actors saw opportunity. China offered to build data centers under African ownership. Russia pledged cybersecurity expertise to be trained and supervised locally. India proposed fiber optic infrastructure that would remain fully under national control. Their offers were strategic, but they resonated with African leaders eager to break old patterns of dependency. For once, they were not at the table as petitioners, but as negotiators setting terms. The media war intensified. Western outlets emphasized fears of instability, while African journalists produced exposés showing how data extraction had shaped mining contracts and manipulated fuel policies. Hashtags such as #OurData, and #AfricaRising dominated social platforms. Al Jazeera called the raids the unveiling of a hidden empire. The Global Times hailed them as the dawn of technological independence. Diplomatic tensions escalated in Brussels, where European Union officials threatened sanctions if Burkina Faso's policies violated international investment norms. Yet within the same continent, German and Spanish firms began rebranding themselves as sovereignty compliant, eager not to lose contracts. The fault lines of global economics were suddenly visible, drawn not across battlefields but across cables. At the heart of this debate was a simple truth. Control of information meant control of destiny. For African leaders, the discovery was not only about foreign espionage, but about the essence of independence itself. If sovereignty was once defined by land and armies, it was now defined by servers and codes. To defend this new frontier was to defend the continent's future. And for the first time in decades, the phrase African sovereignty carried not only historical weight but immediate urgency. But questions lingered. Would Africa's unity hold against the pressure of sanctions and lobbying? Could these offers from new partners be trusted, or were they merely another form of dependency? And most importantly, was this truly the birth of a doctrine or only a fleeting moment of defiance? As the dust settled over Ouagadougou, a deeper question emerged. What comes next? Operation Clearsight had pulled back the curtain on an invisible empire, but dismantling servers was only the first step. The greater challenge lay ahead, building systems that could withstand the relentless pressure of global powers while nurturing Africa's own capacity for growth. In the short term, the risks were obvious. Western governments signaled possible sanctions, framing Burkina Faso's actions as dangerous isolationism. Some multinational corporations suspended contracts, waiting to see if the new regulations would endure. European think tanks warned that cutting ties with established partners could drive the nation into economic hardship. Yet these warnings were not new. They echoed the same language once used against African nations seeking independence from colonial rule, a reminder that the fight for sovereignty had never been welcomed by those who benefited from dependency. At the same time, opportunities flourished. Regional startups seized the space left by departing multinationals. Young engineers launched platforms certified under new sovereignty standards, while fintech companies relocated back to African cities to comply with local rules. Countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco announced plans to follow Burkina Faso's example, drafting their own data laws. The momentum was no longer confined to one nation. It was becoming continental. For citizens, the transformation was tangible. Internet services became faster and cheaper. Community centers provided digital access under transparent oversight. Conversations once dominated by politics or land disputes now revolved around servers, encryption, and privacy rights. A lecturer in Nairobi captured the mood. Our independence was won on the battlefield. Our future will be won in the cloud. But perhaps the greatest challenge is unity. If Burkina Faso walks alone, its strength may falter. But if Africa walks together, it can create a doctrine as powerful as any border treaty. The proposed framework, data stored locally, foreign contracts audited, collective response to violations, is fragile yet full of promise. For the first time, nations are considering treating digital trespass as seriously as military invasion. This path is neither easy nor certain. Building secure data centers demands resources. Training local engineers takes time, and resisting pressure from powerful economies will test political will. Yet the dawn raids have already shifted the balance of imagination. What once seemed impossible now feels inevitable, that Africa can define its own digital destiny. The soil of sovereignty has been tilled once more. The seeds of dignity have been planted in servers, cables, and codes. What remains is the harvest. A harvest that will depend on whether Africans choose partnership over pity, trade over aid, and unity over silence. The raids in Ouagadougou were not the end of the story. They were the opening chapter of a struggle that will shape a generation. And as the continent stands on the edge of this new frontier, one question rings louder than all others. Will Africa rise together, or will it be divided once again by those who fear its freedom? Operation Clearsight began as a dawn raid in Ouagadougou. Servers were seized, hard drives sealed, and hidden networks dragged into the light. But the meaning of that morning runs deeper than confiscated machines. It symbolized a continent awakening to the reality that sovereignty is not only measured in borders or armies, it is measured in the control of information, the lifeblood of a nation. For decades, Africa was treated as a passive space, its soil mapped, its minerals extracted, its citizens reduced to statistics. What was revealed in Burkina Faso showed that the same pattern had migrated into the digital sphere. Data was the new gold, the new oil, the new weapon. And just as past generations stood against colonial occupation, today's generation must rise against this invisible domination. This is the spirit of anti-colonial Africa reborn for the 21st century. The implications reach far beyond one country. Across markets, universities, and villages, people are now speaking of privacy as a right, of data as a national resource, of servers as the fortresses of independence. Governments are drafting new laws, regional unions are debating collective doctrines, and startups are stepping forward to claim the ground once monopolized by outsiders. The narrative has shifted. Africa is not begging for inclusion. It is demanding respect. This is why the phrase African sovereignty carries more weight today than at any time since independence movements swept the continent. It is no longer only about flags or anthems. It is about who controls the cables under the sea, the satellites in the sky, the servers in the cities. The choice is stark: either allow the flow of identity to be dictated from abroad or claim the right to shape one's own future. The world will resist this shift. Sanctions may come, contracts may be threatened, narratives may be distorted, but the flame has already been lit. And as voices rise from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, from Bamako to Lagos, a single truth emerges. Anti-colonial Africa is no longer a dream of the past. It is the movement of the present. So the question I leave with you is simple. If one small nation can expose a hidden empire, what stops the rest? If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, share your voice, and stand with this moment in history.